In 2011, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution which recognized happiness as a fundamental human goal and called for a more inclusive, equitable, and balanced approach to economic growth that promotes the happiness and well-being of all peoples. In 2012, the first ever UN Conference on Happiness took place, and the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution which decreed that the International Day of Happiness would be observed every year on March 20. As we approach this year's International Day of Happiness, I wonder, how happy do Canadians think they are? And what impacts do perceptions about our lives, about our future, about the country as a whole, impact how we feel? Welcome back to inFocus with David Coletto. I'm David Coletto. On this episode, I'm joined by two of my colleagues from Abacus Data, Richard Jenkins and Oksana Kiszczuk. Oksana and Richard lead our firm's Happiness Monitor program, a research focus we started in October of 2020 that tracks how happy or not Canadians are at any given moment and explores what makes us happy and what makes us sad. Our conversation looks at what we've learned so far, why measuring happiness is so important, and what drives national happiness, especially during a global pandemic. I am so glad they agreed to join the podcast. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Oksana and Richard, welcome to inFocus. So happy you've agreed to join, and I get to share the experience of working with both of you with listeners. So welcome, and how are you both doing?
For Monday.
Happiness, and happiness is something we love to talk about. So,
well, that's great, Richard. I want to start with you by I guess the basic question is, why should we measure happiness in the first place?
You know, when we first started talking about this project, happiness seemed like a pretty general measure of our state of mind. But on reflection, it's a deeply personal, and it really is a motivator. Think about all the decisions we make in our life, whether it's our relationships, the products we buy. Decisions are all about sort of accounting, right? Some sort of maximization of our happiness and minimizing of our unhappiness. And, you know, this seems like the right time, given that on top of all of that, people are talking about mental health as a pandemic problem. And so getting a sense of our collective sense of well-being, I think, is really important these days.
And I think it's interesting that a number of countries, I don't think Canada is one of them, but a number of countries have started measuring happiness and using it as one of the key performance indicators of how well they're doing, right? We often hear of, GDP growth, GDP per capita, Gini coefficient as a way to measure inequality. And now, particularly in Scandinavia, I think a lot of countries in Europe and the UN as a whole, because they later this week, we're going to be celebrating the International Day of Happiness, have said happiness is actually what we should be striving towards, not, some measure of wealth or growth. Oksana, what's your thoughts on, the idea of measuring happiness in the first place?
I think I sort of echo Richard in that it's something that's sort of intrinsically part of your personal life journey, not to get very philosophical, but I think you can take this conversation in that direction for sure. But you can also take it in the very sort of calculated, and that it's something worth measuring direction, like you were talking about, David, in terms of measuring in terms of the countries and wanting to kind of keep an eye on it, because it really does indicate a lot of different things. I know we'll kind of get into this later, and I'm kind of going to jump the gun on this, but when Richard and I first started talking about happiness and why we should measure it and what sort of impacts, one of the things that kept coming up was political involvement, civic engagement. Not necessarily that it would impact how you would vote, but the more engaged you are in your community, the more happy you are, which I thought was a really interesting relationship. And that's been something that's been reflected in our data throughout, which is kind of one of the most consistent things that's been sort of tracking. And I really find that fascinating as someone who involved myself in the topic, like through school and just kind of how we work in the field we're in, that engaging in that, while the topics in civic engagement aren't necessarily positive, for some reason engaging in that in your community sort of drives some sort of level of happiness. So I think that sort of validates for me that there's really real implications for that number, and that politicians should be looking at it. If people are more engaged in their community, they're more likely to be purchasing in their community differently. Like it really does impact stuff more than I was expecting it would.
And it's really interesting. You talk about civic engagement as an example. In my mind, it's like a chicken and egg problem, right? Does civic engagement increase your happiness? But does happiness, is that a precondition to being engaged in your community? Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of reasons. Revolutions happen not because people are happy. So civic engagement can also be spiked by a very low level of happiness, right? That it actually creates the impetus to want to change the direction of your country or your political system. But I think there's clearly a relationship between those two. I also think that, the reason to measure it is because it seems like for almost all people, I imagine, the ultimate goal, right? We want to be happy. And I always think back to, or not think back, I think of the US, Declaration of Independence. The pursuit of happiness was sort of built into the DNA of the US. And we'll talk about Canada versus the US in a moment, but I always come back to that. Whereas Canadians, we always just say, just peace, order, and good government. We don't need to be happy. We just need order and good governance around that. Oksana, let's put our researcher methodologist hat on for a second here and just help people understand how we are measuring perceived happiness. And let's go through that, and then also start tackling the question, is it something we can even measure? Lots of debate about such a subjective, emotional measure, metric. Can we even measure it?
Yeah, so I'll sort of, I guess, kind of talk about the high level stuff, and then I'll let Richard kind of dig into those numbers, because I know he's done a lot and he seems to really enjoy that piece of it. So kind of to start, what we sort of use and what we have been using in the happiness monitors, to start, just a very kind of simple question, like on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 to 100, where 0 is miserable and the top of the scale is extremely happy, where do you think you fall? And that's sort of a personal assessment of kind of, they can take in their own definition of happiness, because again, it's very personal. They can sort of evaluate where they are in their own life, and sort of, it's almost, I kind of see it as kind of like that open-end version of what we're studying, open-end question kind of thing. But then the other thing that we've been sort of tracking and adding on is that to sort of quantify happiness a little bit more. So because it's so personal, we do have that sort of general question, but then there's also sort of specific. So Richard talked a lot about sort of like that control and adding and subtracting. And so being able to sort of see a direction in your life is something that we're looking at, whether the stuff that you're doing in your life and directing has been rewarding for you. Then there's that sort of component of your relationships with people in your sort of inner network. And then also that sort of back to that civic engagement community thing. So all of these sort of pieces are things that we sort of looked at what others were doing in the research and kind of said that these are likely to be some of the drivers that we think are going to sort of affect happiness. And then what we've been doing, and I think Richard maybe get into, is kind of looking at all of those pieces put together and sort of seeing how they all sort of interact with each other and how they make up that overall happiness.
And just before we get there, Richard, what do you say to people who say, this whole exercise is a waste of time, we can't measure this?
Well, I think there's very few things you can't find some way to measure. And maybe love is maybe the one you can't measure or quantify very well. But happiness really is a good for people to understand. And that's, from a measurement point of view, one of the challenges that you usually have is that you can't measure something that people don't understand, but people actually do understand if they're happy or not. They can express it, and so all we're doing is getting them to express that numeric way. And it turns out that it makes sense. And I think the validation of the measurement is more in that we start looking at the components of happiness, and when we look at the depth of happiness, it means itself in a way. And even when we look at how it's changed over time, not some random noise out there. I read something recently that 40% of happiness is, and 60% is is the things that are happening in your life. And so that's a lot that we can put our measurement skills to capture.
Yeah, that's a lot of potential variability, right? From one day to the next. And I just think of my own like mood, is the sun shining or not? Is it warming up or not? Did I get a good night's sleep, right? All of those probably predict whether when I wake up the next day, and you guys have to work with me, am I going to be in a good mood or not so much? So let's, Oksana, I'm sure the listeners are wondering, because it's been a long lead in to just get to the punchline, which is, how happy are Canadians right now?
Well, I would say, I can tell you the score of our latest release, which is 64 on a scale of 100. So, all things considered, since we started tracking, which we did start tracking in the midst of a global pandemic, so there is that to sort of watch for when we hopefully leave this. But we are sort of the happiest that we've been since we started tracking, which is, I think, and we can get into this again, like a combination of factors. It's potentially the warmer weather. There's whole winter blues. There's been a lot of research kind of in the last, those couple really gloomy gloomy winter months of sort of January, February, where everyone was stuck inside and we were just wanting the weather to get better, wanting to get out. We were just tired of being in lockdown. I think all of those sort of factors combined contributed to that bit of a dip that we did see kind of in February. But I think that it's sort of hopefully on the up and up as news gets better and things start to get better. And those sorts of things that we're tracking against, like the weather, we're tracking against, are we able to go make connections again with our community? I think that that's an important thing. Is isolation is something that is definitely driving happiness scores down, or it was instead of those previous months in January. But I think we're hopefully on the rise.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we don't see a whole lot of variation, right? We aren't seeing like 10-point swings from one month to the next, but we are noticing. And when we're interviewing 1,500 to 2,000 Canadians, a 1 or 2 point difference on average is real, right? It's statistically significant. It's not the same way you would interpret, a percentage in answers to a question. It's a very different way of looking at it. So Richard, when you look at that trend line, and again, we only started this in October, so we unfortunately don't have data to say how happy were we on March 1st or 15th, the day before lockdown. But we at least see moments over the last number of months where happiness has gone up and down. Can you point to, Richard, a few of those moments on that track that come back to what you said earlier, that the measure seems to be rational and logical in how the country is reacting to the events that we're seeing around us?
First started measuring at 63, pretty close to where it is now. And then it really dipped, and it dipped when the rest of the world seemingly was getting vaccines and rolling out plans in early November. And Canada, when the Prime Minister admitted that Canada was not going to be first in line to get vaccines. But as we got into December and it looked like we were going to get deliveries of vaccines at the end of the month, it kind of stabilized, and it looked off, through December and into early January, really stable, so stable that I remember thinking to myself in early January, maybe there isn't a whole lot of variation here in the midst of a pandemic. And then, January hit, and it was really the three things, I think. It's a tough time. January, February, everybody. We were all, especially in Ontario and Quebec, in massive lockdowns. And then the news was bad, right? Vaccines weren't coming, new variants were coming. All of those things made for a less happy environment. And we dropped to almost our low at the end of February before now bouncing back. And I think, weather got better. The vaccines started coming. We started getting promises of more vaccines coming. And we know that those things are tied together, that happiness and one sense of the pandemic are tied together.
One of the things that we also do is we don't just ask this one question. We also ask a whole bunch of other things to try to understand the components of happiness, right? And I was playing around with the data and I ran some regression models to sort of see what are the biggest drivers of happiness beyond the things that, Oksana and Richard, you talked about, the weather, how we're feeling one day to the next. But can we start to understand, if you want to improve happiness, right, both nationally, but also at the individual level, what are the things that help people or at least predict happiness? And there's 5 factors that seem to explain in our data set what makes someone report a higher number than a lower number. And the 2 biggest ones are what I describe as anticipation. So the sense you look forward to the start of the day, you have something to look forward to, right? That makes sense to me. That explains about 20% of whether somebody's happy or not. Fulfillment, right? Are you getting meaning out of your life? That's another big driver. So if you don't anticipate the future and you don't feel your life has any meaning, well, then that makes sense to me. You should be less happy, right? You should be at a less happy place in your life. But there's 3 other factors around those that are less important, but still relatively important. And that is the strength and quantity of relationships in your life, right? A sense of optimism, a broader optimism than just anticipation. Are you feeling that the future for the world, for your country, for yourself will be better? And then lastly, interestingly, what's out of the 5 factors, the least important is satisfaction with your life, right? Is your life good? Are you happy and with those elements? So when we think about, and this is the value of the research, when you think about what might drive happiness, fulfillment and anticipation need to be at the core of that. And that's where both public policy, workplace culture, consumer relationships, all of those things can feed into that. And if you create a happy person, right, I think you're going to have a more productive and strong workplace. If you've got a happy consumer, they're probably going to spend more money and stay more loyal to you. And if you've got a happy citizen, well, you're not going to have revolution or revolt or, Oksana, as you described, I think just apathy, right? Who people say, like, I'm just not interested. So I find that really interesting. Oksana, so last week you and Richard, you put out a piece with some analysis that Richard did because we had this opportunity where we actually asked the exact same questions in the United States. So we did a snapshot and we were able to compare, are Canadians happier or not than Americans? What did we find?
So some pretty surprising evidence. And again, like we sort of discussed, like the difference between sort of a 1 degree number on the scale, while it might not seem like a lot, is significant. So we found that we did this sort of tracking back when Canada was at 64 last week, and the United States score on average was 65.4. So again, like not just look at it, doesn't really look like a big difference, but it is a bit of a difference. And it concludes that at that moment, people who live in the United States were happier than those living in Canada, which was an interesting headline to write for myself as I was writing that article, something I didn't think I would find. But looking more into the analysis, I think there's lots to unpack that I sort of started unpacking. Richard started unpacking last week. And I think there's a lot more to look at. And I'd be interested to sort of track the two and how they go. One of the things that sort of stood out to me, and I'm sure stood out to Richard, was that the sort of polarization of happiness that Canadians, and maybe this is kind of our stereotypical, like, life's good, we're Canadians, we like our lives, whatever, kind of more like in the middle.
We're modest, right?
Yeah.
We're a little more modest. So I'm not a 10, I'm more like an 8 or 7.
Yeah, and you don't want to, say you're not happy. So you're like, okay, I'm a 6. It's okay. Whereas people in the United States were kind of more likely to pick numbers on the bit of an extreme. And I guess we could probably have a whole podcast on like the psychology of Canadians versus Americans and why they felt the need to score themselves the way they did. But I think one of the things that sort of stood out to me about why that is that there's a lot more sort of inequality in happiness and perhaps inequality in the United States as well. And that a lot of the different sort of demographic things that we looked at. Richard and I released something, I think, back in January about sort of the demographics of happiness in Canada, who's happier, who's not. And there were some differences for sure, but it was a lot more sort of middle of the road compared to when I started looking at in the United States. Things like income were wildly different. Gender, which didn't really seem to matter that much in Canada, was quite a big difference. So I think the way...
I'm going to interrupt there. In what direction on gender? Are women less happy than men in the US? And again, self-reporting.
Yeah. So that, I believe, in Richard, you can correct me, putting me on the spot with the data there, but I believe that women were less happy. If anyone else wants to jump in there, that's what they said.
Like much less happy.
Yes. And I mean, there's so much to get into about like why that is. Is it that amongst women? Is it women who are, especially in the States, is it Black Americans? Is it people who are in the Latin community? Is it people who are lower income? Is it people who are living in sort of like the Rust Belt? Like there's all sorts of, and I find this fascinating, which is why I'm hoping to track it again, but there's so much more overlap between different sort of what different measures mean, what different demographics mean than in Canada. They certainly impact things here, but it was really interesting.
Well, I mean, if you think about, the same is happening in Canada, although to your point, we don't see as big or maybe any gender gap in happiness in Canada. But in the United States, I was on a sort of a Clubhouse. I've never done Clubhouse conversation with Politico last week, and we were talking about the economics and the recovery. And there was an economist she's done so much work on the C-cession. I can never say that, right? And how this economic recession has severely impacted women, particularly young women, in a way that previous recessions haven't. And so when you tell me that American women are less likely to report high levels of happiness than men, then that feels right, given the challenges that women are facing in the US, where in large parts of Canada, schools have gone back. In large parts of the United States, schools have never gone back throughout this year. And we know that women, moms, are more likely to be caregivers and having to, juggle both taking after their kids and being teacher mom at the same time that she might have to work or have to give up work in order to play that caregiving role. So really, really interesting. Richard, on the Canadian front, and just to build off of what Oksana was talking about, in our research, we don't see a lot of demographic differences. Are there any regional differences in Canada? Are Albertans less or more happy than Ontarians, or how does Quebec fit into that? Do we see any patterns there?
There's not a lot of regional differences. Quebec, in one of our last polls, I think was happier than average, but never sort of in the middle. There are some demographic differences. Young people are less happy than older ones. I'm really curious whether that's a life stage kind of thing, or whether that's a pandemic thing, holding back their lives in some variety of ways, whether that's not being able to get married or not being able to enter the workforce. So we do see young people less happy, but nowhere near as less happy as American young people. And while they say money can't buy happiness, I can assure you that those people who have money are happier and by like a significant amount. And so it gives giving them a sense of that they're not struggling as much probably. And it's the that really stands out. And then we also found, although it's been less consistent, that religious Canadians tend to be a little bit happier, but it's not a huge difference.
I find the youth gap really interesting. And Richard, you raised up an interesting point about life stage. But Oksana, and the work we've done, you've done a lot of work with a number of national youth serving agencies in 2020. You work with student organizations. Tell me a little bit about what that research points to you that might explain why younger Canadians, report being less happy. Because I think that this pandemic has put up, in my mind, more roadblocks to many people's kind of life goals. And if we believe that anticipation, or if the data tells us anticipation and fulfillment are like the keys to happiness, well, then given what's going on, it feels like that's harder today for young people than it was even a year ago.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like when you look at those top two measures, ideally as a young person, you have most of your life ahead of you. You have a lot to anticipate. That's supposed to be something that's high, it's driving you, maybe not fulfillment because you still have lots ahead of you, but anticipation definitely. But I think that you're right in that how the pandemic has sort of impacted that measure, especially among young Canadians, has impacted it negatively. And I just think of some of the research that I did with those youth serving organizations back in the fall about sort of optimism and how people are like, what are you excited about your future? Is that something you're looking forward to? Like something that you want to sort of progress to? And people were kind of like, meh, I don't know. And I can see why. Like I've been on a couple panels where we've talked about just even like who is going to be responsible for the recovery, who's going to have to pay for the recovery, who's going to have to sort of see the recovery through. It's all those young Canadians who are starting their career sort of in the middle of the pandemic. I'm lucky in that I kind of was sandwiched in between two sort of hard times to start a job, but there's certainly different parts of my life that will end up like more so be impacted for me than older Canadians. Employment is something that's really big. I think young Canadians lost their jobs in huge numbers at the start of the pandemic, and they've been sort of slowest to recover. One of those groups that's been slowest to recover in jobs. And I think, while working isn't everything, like Richard said, having sort of money and even having stability, a salary, a household income where you don't have to worry about your bills is crucial to being happiness. You can't even think about anything else if you can't cover your bills. And so I think that those are definitely things that are going to keep driving that.
Yeah. And that's a really good point about like, you know, I'll describe it as security, a sense of security. It's a sense of, you know, that whether it's the here and now, that I have a job that allows me to pay my rent or pay my student debt or live the life I want, but also a prospective sense of security, that the future will be good, that I'll have opportunities. And I think, you know, I see it, I teach at Carleton, I see it with my students, I see it with even some of you guys, the younger members of our team. Like, what does that future look like where the housing market is not any more affordable? It's actually more unaffordable today than it was at the start of the pandemic. Climate change is not going away, right? Like all of these existential big issues that people are feeling, I think it's something for us as a country to really think about, right? And as we think about the recovery, how do we ensure that the youngest generations are not just supported and given the policy tools they need to get ahead, but that they have a sense of purpose and hope? Because I think this gap in happiness is something that we should really be mindful of. So, no, really interesting. Okay. Last area I want to talk about is, this is a podcast about the intersection of public opinion and politics. We haven't really talked about politics all that much yet. So Richard, when you look at the data, the first thing I asked, because I'm a political nerd, was, are Liberals more happy than Conservatives in Canada? And are Republicans less happy than Democrats because, hey, they just stormed the US Capitol, or at least a subset of Republicans stormed the US Capitol? What's the data tell us about both Canada and the US from a political lens perspective?
Well, and I think happiness is such an important indicator because in the US, there's a difference. Republicans are happy Democrats, which seems surprising given they just got kicked out of the White House and they parted them to storm the White House, the Congress. But they're a little bit happier than Democrats. Canada, conservatives and liberal voters tend to be quite similar on happiness. There's not this big partisan gap between our two biggest parties. The people unhappy are the people who don't vote, NDP voters and somewhat Green voters. And so in some ways, that's what makes it's such an interesting measure, because as you know, if we ask, do you think the country's going in the wrong direction, we get a very view of that question. But if the two biggest parties in Canada sort of agree on our level of happiness, it kind of gives us a potentially forward-looking measure of the problems in the country. It's not being so influenced by sort of motivated reasoning where I'm going to say the country's going well because my party's is in power. And I think that was the thing to me away in the less partisan nature of happiness in Canada.
I also think, and maybe this is a reflection of the two countries, and I asked the question, is it really in the US a partisan difference? Or does it come back to what we were talking about, Oksana, earlier, about how if you look at the groups in the US that are less happy, they tend to be, as we already said, young people, people of color, lower income folks. They typically are Democrats, at least right now. And so it almost is that, which explains the deep polarization in the United States in the first place, is that some of those other identities or demographics actually probably are the better predictors of happiness in the US than how they vote or how they see themselves.
Yeah, I think that identity piece is really really key. And I think that being in those different groups, although is important in Canada, is perhaps more of a divisive thing. Like it's something that's more likely to be discussed than in Canada. And I think that sort of whole identity piece, the fact that you would even identify with a group, identify with different groups, and then not identify with other groups. I think that division, politics and other demographics in the US is a lot more polarized than in Canada. And because happiness is somewhat tied to being fulfilled, are you more fulfilled among the people in your demographic? There's something entirely new that you can compare to that you might not be able to compare to in Canada. It gives you a whole new sort of community to connect to. There's so many different sort of like bubbles that you're sort of a part of and can compare and connect, and that makes the relationship all the more complex. But then I also think it's why it's making it so polarized, is because there's so many more pieces, I think.
One of the things that I want us to look at, and we'll talk about where we're going with this project in a minute, is whether social media use makes us happy or less happy, right? There's a theory that those that are active on Instagram or other kinds of more social media, I don't put Twitter there because I'm not sharing photos of like my vacation on Twitter as all that much, but that particularly young people who are active on Instagram, as an example, they feel sad because they're constantly comparing themselves to other people, right? Oksana, to your point about those bubbles or those networks that we have. And so that's an area we should explore. I think I'm going to put that on our agenda. But let's wrap up this chat by giving our listeners a sense of where you want to explore next. This question of happiness's impact on X. What are some of the X's, Richard and Oksana, you want to explore over the next few months?
Although we've started it and we did some stuff on happiness in cities, I think I want to explore a little bit more, and I want to explore the workplace more. A huge part of our lives, and not just work from how do I enjoy working at Abacus Data, but how does my career choices feed into my sense and accomplishment and stuff, and that can help us with thinking about how young people are going to deal with this changing labor market over the next decade.
Oksana, what about you? What's your top 2 or 3 focuses going forward?
I think I'm going to sort of piggyback a little bit on what you said, and in terms of that sort of comparison piece, and something that I'm really interested in. The fact that there were not as many demographic differences in Canada as the US was something that was really interesting to me, and that the fact that there's potentially like a lot more inequality, income inequality, that sort of thing. in the States than in Canada right now. But a lot of what we've been sort of tracking during the pandemic and what I've been really interested in is whether or not that gap is going to grow in Canada. There's people who lost their jobs and haven't been able to get it because they're working in different sectors. There's young Canadians, people like me, who housing was like pretty unaffordable. And I was like, well, if I save a little bit more, I'll be okay. And now I'm like, I could buy a little shack like in rural Ontario, maybe, but that's very expensive already. And so those sort of gaps that were there, I think kind of in the background are really starting to grow. So looking at whether or not those sort of things influence people, but then also sort of that comparing sort of piece. Are you happier compared to other people? That almost sort of jealousy piece, how it plays out within peer networks, but then also if there's sort of generational jealousy, if there's income bracket jealousy, how that sort of, I don't know if it would, I don't think it would start a revolution in Canada, but I think it would certainly sort of impact happiness. And when you sort of change the perspective on asking that question, I'm really interested to see. Right now we're asking it pretty introspectively and sort of comparing your own lives, but really interested to see if compared to others. How do you think you're doing? Would you be happier if you had these things? I think that's, as those gaps grow, I think that's something that I'd be really interested in watching.
I'm particularly interested in exploring this whole idea outside of a pandemic, because I think one of the things we don't know, because we haven't been tracking it prior, is whether we start to see some of that demographic or political differences actually emerge in a world where we all aren't collectively getting through this and we aren't all being affected, right, in different ways by this pandemic. And back to the point about politics, whether that creates opportunities and threats to different political actors on how do you talk to Canadians if they're generally feeling down versus feeling up, and what does that look like in terms of communications and rhetoric and all those kinds of things. So we are going to continue to track this. I'm so excited about this project, and I do want to thank you for spending some time today. And as we approach the International Day of Happiness on March 20th, I hope that trend line that we're seeing continues to go up and that we're all feeling happy. I do recall that the International Day of Happiness in the Northern Hemisphere is the day before spring, which is an exciting kind of pivot point for us Canadians because we can look forward to less snow and more sun. So Oksana and Richard, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to see you in a few minutes on our next call, but take care.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.
See you.